Are you stressed? Are you exhausted? Are you fatigued at work, in the workplace? Maybe you're working from home. We want to share some information with you today. Welcome back to the Help for Leaders podcast. I'm Stacey Harris. Before we dive into today's episode, click here to subscribe, share this episode, click that thumbs up, ring that bell so you're notified each week. So I've got Dawn Delaney with the Center for Relational Care joining me again on today's episode. Really excited. We're going to be talking about mental health in the workplace and really kind of the evolution of the past, several years, but specifically things that have normalized in the last 2 years during the pandemic. So welcome, Dawn. Why don't you introduce yourself to our audience, and then we'll dive in.
Yeah, so like Stacey said, I'm Dawn Delaney. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Relational Care here in Austin, Texas. And we have 5 offices here in the Austin area and 2 in the Atlanta, Georgia area. So we have a pretty spread out workforce.
Yeah. And how many employees do you have total, or professional
just
counselors?
over 40. So we have about 35 counselors, and then we have several full-time administrative staff.
Yeah, in multi-sites in Austin and then in 2 different states.
Yeah.
So, wow, that's a lot in itself. And I think we're going to talk about that.
We are.
Not on this episode, but on the next episode. So let's, you referenced a study. You sent me a study about just mental health in the workplace. And I know just for me, over the past several years, I've worked in all kinds of organizations where mental health just wasn't talked about. It was more
It's kind of been a stigma.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, you have a problem. Like, this is a problem. We need you to, contact employee assistance. They will help solve your problem. And we're not going to deal with that. I mean, that was...
Keep that out of the workplace.
Yeah, don't bring it here. We expect you to show up 100%, give it all, be full on, and
not be human.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Not be human. But then now, thank you, coronavirus, we have a global pandemic that has caused everyone to go home for a while. I mean, there was the quarantine where we were all sent home, working from home. I know many of my clients are still working from home. I have some that are just now re-engaging back into the workplace, but only like 3 days a week.
Yeah, and some will never go back.
Exactly.
Some will continue to work from home.
Yeah. I have some people that said, my job has actually been deemed remote indefinitely, and they've moved and they are doing different things. So a lot of transition, a lot of change in the workplace. But I will say, even with the teams that I've worked with, I've had clients break down.
Yeah.
In some heavy emotion, just the stress, the isolation, the juggling children. We talked about that in last week's episode of helping our kids in this unprecedented time that we don't even really know how to navigate, and helping them. And so lots and lots of fatigue, stress, all the things.
Yes.
And
so much that our nervous system is carrying all of the time.
Yes. And so I know you shared with me a term, psychological safety. And I've heard people say things like, I don't feel safe. And I'm like, well, sometimes I'm thinking, what do you mean? Like, I'm not a harsh person.
I'm not a dangerous person.
What do you mean you don't feel safe? And when you sent me that article on psychological safety in the workplace, everything I read, I was like, oh, this is what we've been teaching for years about suspending judgment, listening, creating a safe place where people can share things without fear of retribution, and all of these things. I was like, oh, that's what
people are talking about.
Okay, there's this new term on something that we've been talking about for years, in creating a place where you can give and receive feedback openly, and really listen and feel connected and not judged. And that's what
people
it means.
are talking about. Yes.
So let's talk about that further. I would love for you to kind of talk about that psychological safety, what that means, how we can do that for each other in the workplace to really normalize all of the things that we're feeling and experiencing in this season.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to clarify, maybe provide a little bit further clarification.
Yes, please do, because that was my interpretation.
No, that was perfect. It was great. But I think sometimes when we hear safety or I'm not feeling safe, where we can immediately go to in our mind is feeling like, oh, they just told me I'm not a safe person. It's exactly what you were saying. Like, I'm not going to be harsh with you. I'm not a dangerous person.
Right.
But really what people are saying is there's something in my nervous system. I talk about the nervous system a lot. I know it might be weird language if you're not used to it, but there's something in my nervous system that isn't able to settle or feel comfortable to really open up and share what's on my heart to share. And so that's what people mean when they say I don't feel safe. They're not offering a judgment or being critical of the other person. They're just saying there's something in me that doesn't feel comfortable letting my guard down and bringing my whole self into this relationship or this
and we've
conversation.
all felt that. We have literally all felt that.
Yeah.
In probably every relationship that we've had, and especially at work. And I would say on teams that I'm working with now that have literally come together remotely in the last 2 years and have never met each other face to face. So trust is hard to build in that environment. So I can see where it's even a bigger issue. I know I was on a call yesterday with a team again talking about transition and change, and a lot of silence on the call because we're talking about some hard things, and it's hard to do that and be that vulnerable with people that you don't know that well. Only interacted with a few times in person. Most of your interaction is Slack or email, and now we're kind of trying to dig in quickly to those hard conversations because we haven't built that level of trust.
Right. Well, and like we talked about in last week's episode, when you're in person, you can borrow each other's groundedness. You can feel in the room. Does this feel comfortable and safe to be vulnerable? But virtually is a whole nother ball game, and it's possible, but it's harder when we haven't had that felt experience in the room with someone previously. So we have to get really creative. We have to be really intentional, and I think, have to expect it to go slower.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. To lower the expectation if we're going to get there faster, because it is going to take more time. And that's normal, right?
And that's normal.
It should take time to build that trust.
Yes. And it actually wouldn't be wise to be vulnerable before you feel comfortable or safe to be vulnerable. I think there's this innate wisdom that we each have that says, I don't think that would be a good idea for me to offer that right now.
Yeah.
And I think we need to celebrate that. I think we need to really not only be accepting of that, but be affirming of that for one another.
So I've heard you say that it's going to take time, time to build that level of trust with others, to be able to say the things that really need to be said. And what else? Are there other things that we can do?
Absolutely. So I have some notes with me just because there's a little bit more to this. And so I think as leaders, one of the most helpful things that we can do is to model vulnerability for people that we're leading. You've probably heard the term power differential. With any person in leadership, there's an inherent power differential that is felt in the relationship by the person who is not the leader, whether we want it to be there or not. It's there. And so one of the ways that we can help kind of break that barrier, if you will, and equalize the playing field is by modeling vulnerability and being human ourselves, right? So that is creating then the expectation that that's okay, that is normal, that is acceptable. Of course, we're doing that in appropriate ways. We're not offloading all of our stress onto our employees, but maybe we're letting them know, hey, actually, I don't know the answer to that. I don't have this all figured out. I'm having a hard time managing and juggling all of the work-life responsibilities as well. And we can have compassion for our employees and be with them in it versus being set apart and then kind of giving them the impression that there's this standard you should be attaining that is unrealistic.
Yeah, that's so good. And I know for some of us, I tend to overshare. And so there are appropriate amounts of disclosure that should
Yeah,
happen
absolutely.
to create that safety on your team.
Yeah.
You don't have to tell all of the
Everything,
things.
right. You're
So
not expecting your team to care for you necessarily.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So knowing yourself, self-awareness, and then knowing your team and really, but I think modeling that is beautiful, and you can do it in ways that are very much with boundaries and very much being open at the same time.
Yeah, we have a term for it in counseling, appropriate self-disclosure.
Okay, there we go. That's what I was trying to get at, because I'm like, I could see someone like me listening going, okay, I just had permission to share all the things.
Yes. No, don't do that. So, I mean, maybe.
Exactly,
But where it's
yes.
appropriate. But appropriate self-disclosure is for the purpose of benefiting the other person.
Yeah.
It's to normalize something. It's to create safety for the other person to be vulnerable. So it's actually not for us. It's
So
for
good.
the other person.
So good.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a second tip.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah. And then asking for input often. So asking for ideas, asking for feedback, asking what's working, what's not working, but really allowing others to speak into the process and then taking a risk to try new things. So rather than saying, oh no, we don't do that because we've never done that, I think COVID has created this space where we've all had to get really creative and really flexible. And so now I think is the best time, maybe a better time than ever, to say, why not? Let's try it. Let's see if it works. And if it doesn't, we'll regroup, we'll reevaluate, we'll do something different.
And that really creates a space for a team to feel valued, to feel heard, to be a part. Like, oh, they actually want to know. And that's what I am all about. Teams, really, it's not just about the leader. It's about really listening to others. It's about asking for input. Let's try something new. So
We're in this together.
Yes, right in alignment. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, and then beyond that, one of the things that we talk about at CRC that is actually one of my favorite values that we have is we talk about that when we have this sense of being glad to be with one another, that produces a joy-filled environment. It fosters connection, and it actually helps to mitigate compassion fatigue and burnout. And so we really strive to monitor within ourselves and within our relationships with one another, am I feeling glad to be with you? And if I'm losing that sense, because that happens, if I lose that sense of feeling glad to be with you, I'm going to be intentional to get back to that as quickly as possible. And what that means is that we may have to have a conversation. We may have to talk about something that is not going well, or we may have to say, hey, can I let you know that this actually hurt my feelings, and do some repair in our relationships. But the goal is for us as often as possible to have the experience in working together that we're glad to be with one another.
Oh my gosh. When you said mitigating, what did you say? And reducing burnout, there was another word.
Compassion
fatigue. There we go. I was like, yes.
Yeah.
That is what is so needed, because I am seeing that over and over and over again with so many of my clients that I'm working with.
Yeah.
It's just like, I am exhausted. I'm burnt out. So having the hard conversations, or maybe it's not hard, maybe it's easy. And if we model it and do it enough, hopefully
it's a risk.
It
takes vulnerability to say, oh, actually this isn't feeling good to me.
Yeah. And having the conversation. That's so powerful. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Yeah, and like you just said, checking in. If we make it the norm to check in with one another, and we have had to get really creative with that in this culture, because we're seeing some people in person, we're seeing some people remotely, sometimes it's a hybrid. So, and some people respond well to email, some to text, some to a voice text or a video call. And so really learning each employee and how they prefer to communicate, and being intentional to check in. And to do it regularly. So it's not just a sporadic, once in a blue moon, I'm checking in with you, but I really want to know, how are you doing?
Yeah. And that's one thing that we touch on a lot, is in times of change and transition, which is where we are living, over communicate. Over communicate. You cannot check in enough. You cannot, you just have to do it more than feels normal or necessary for us to really be able to be intentional. So I love that you mentioned figuring out each person's communication style, because we do have, and that's challenging for a leader.
It is.
To be able to do.
It is, because sometimes we just want to say, well, this is my communication style.
And this is the way I'm going to do it. Right. I'm going to send you all a Slack message, and hopefully that does the trick.
Right.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So that's really helpful. So is that the last one?
Yeah. I think there's a couple more, but I'll be brief. I mean, I think part of what helps create safety in the workplace is when we as leaders are in tune with ourselves and we're pursuing our own health and our own healing. So we're actually modeling, and as we're talking about reducing the stigma around getting support for mental health concerns, we are all dealing with some amount of anxiety. Right? And some amount of burnout, maybe some depression. There's been a lot of people in isolation in this season, and isolation it's really difficult. It's really easy to become depressed in isolation. And so when we are intentional to pursue our own healing and then be open with others in appropriate ways, that we're open to pursuing that healing, that's creating safety, it's normalizing it, and our health is then benefiting our teams.
Oh, that's so good. I love that. Just normalizing all of the emotions that we're feeling, normalizing mental health in the workplace, the stress that we're under, what it's doing to even our physical bodies. So tapping into what you need to be able to regulate all those emotions, talking about it with others, modeling it to your teams, being open, suspending all of the judgment, listening, leaning in.
And having compassion on yourself.
It's so important.
When we have compassion on ourselves, then we're more easily able to have compassion on others. So we're not going to do it perfectly. It's just not going to happen. So give yourself permission to be human.
Yes.
Please be a human
in
this environment. Have compassion on yourself, and then extend that compassion to your team.
So good. So good. And I think the more we do it, the more it might not be easy, or I don't know the word I'm looking for, but
come more naturally.
Come more naturally. It's just like the more we practice, the more we put that into place, the more we have compassion for ourselves, the more that those neural pathways are developed, and we go right back to that instead of our old habits that were possibly something that was not a healthy.
Feeling like we had to have it all together.
Exactly. Well, thank you, Dawn, for joining us today. I hope you have learned something, and maybe you're struggling. Maybe you're really having a hard time. I encourage you to reach out to someone in your organization. Reach out to a counselor. I'm sure there are referrals in your organization, in your community, to get some help, because we all can use a little bit of assistance in these days.
And you are worth it.
Yes.
You are worth getting the help and the support that you need.
So good. So good. So thank you for joining us today and really normalizing, just talking about stress, anxiety, all the feelings that we're feeling in the workplace, not just with our friends and our family members, but really talking about it at work. And so thank you, Dawn, for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, she's going to be on next week's episode. We're going to talk about just things she's learned leading in this climate. And so join me next week for more help for leaders. If you enjoyed this episode and would like more information on emotional intelligence, behavioral styles, or communication, I'd love for you to click here to watch more episodes. And we'd also love for you to click here to subscribe so you're notified each week when we post more content.